Thank you for joining us for another episode of In the Pursuit of. This season's pursuit is Blackness and the exploration of Black identity across the globe. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In the Pursuit of. This season's pursuit centers around Blackness and Black identity. Today, we have the fortune of having with us Tyson Goddard. Tyson is a 31-year-old entertainer and activist who lives in Brisbane, otherwise known as Meanjin, Australia, and is of proud Fijian descent. Tyson has always been creative, growing up singing in church, dancing in hip hop crews, and most recently, becoming a drag performer and show producer. He is both the manager of and a performer in Thick Shake Crew, Australia's first all drag, all person of color performance hip hop crew, is a member of the House of Alexander, Meanjin's pioneering Vogue ballroom house, and is also a member of Runway Movement, a queer person of color performance activist collective. Welcome, 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 Tyson. It's really a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm so happy that you're with us today because there's so much we want to explore with you. And first, we just wanted to start by asking you a little about yourself. Where are you from?
Mm,
About your life growing up. It's not often that we get to explore the other side of the world, and so we're fortunate to have this opportunity.
mm.
So, can you share with us a little about who you are, where you're from? What are some of your favorite memories from childhood?
Well, actually, my origin is like a little bit confusing to some people because I'm actually adopted. So I am one of three sons in an adoptive family. I am of Fijian descent, but my adoptive mother is also of Fijian descent. That's normally what confuses a lot of people because they're like, "Oh, but your mom's Fijian," so and I'm like, yes, brown people can adopt as well. It's not just white people. So that's what sort of like gets a lot of people confused a little bit. But yeah, I grew up in near Brisbane, so I grew up a little bit south of the city. And yeah, like I think I've just been a creative kid my whole life. I just transitioned into making that part of my performance art just today. Yeah, so I've always been very interested in using my performance to also fuse that with my activism, as my life has gone on. So yeah, that's basically me at the moment. I would say that that is what takes up a lot of my time in this day and age is yeah, just a lot of my performance activism. Yeah.
Where did you grow up, Tyson? Like
I
what
grew up in
part?
a town called Kujin. That's like the indigenous word for red dirt because there was a lot of red earth. It was near a volcano, so it's actually volcanic soil. So that's where it gets its beautiful name from. And yeah, it was just a small beachside town, but it was very close to the city of Brisbane, or Meanjin as we call it. So yeah, it was a very nice upbringing. Very like had a lot to do with the ocean. I think that my family being a Pacific Islander family was always like, very attached to the ocean. So we always spent a lot of time at the beach, a lot of time being taught how to fish and collect food from the ocean and that sort of thing. And yeah, it was a very idyllic childhood, I have to say. Spent a lot of my childhood in church. That was a huge, massive part of my childhood growing up, and especially my teenage years, like getting to serve, starting to be old enough to serve in church. So really, that's what took up a lot of my time was definitely those activities.
I hear as you speak, we're using a lot of the indigenous words for various places in Australia. Can you
Mm,
give me a little bit more background? Because most of us we know Brisbane, we know the
yeah,
I guess the
Sydney, and
Eurocentric terms
yeah,
for it. Yeah. So can you
yeah.
give me a little more history of what is behind sort of reclaiming these indigenous names for these various places?
Yeah, well, it's exactly like you say, it's reclamation. And I'm so excited that it's happening. I think it's very important, especially because, like, myself, white Australians, we are not the original inhabitants of this land. That is the First Nations, as we call them, or Indigenous people. And before we came here, they already had like their own language system, their own customs. They had their own tribal areas, and a lot of that is ignored. So I'm glad that there is starting to be this movement in Australia of starting to use the traditional language and words for like our different like areas, especially because like there were so many different tribes of Indigenous people split up along the coast of Australia. So there were already names for these places that we've sort of taken, and as you said, we've made them into Eurocentric names. So I'm really glad that we're starting to like educate, especially our younger generations, in what actually the traditional name is from the traditional landowners. So yeah.
And do you see it taking hold, in particular by the younger generation? Do you foresee that it's something that will permeate the society as time goes on?
Oh, definitely. I think they're also doing it at a governmental level as well.
Mm,
So, you know, I mean, I'm not sure how they do it in other countries, but I mean, in Australia, we've always done welcome to countries where we have a representative of the traditional landowners from that area come and welcome to country before we do anything official. And I think that did a lot to really spur on this new movement of using the traditional names even now. I think definitely the younger generations are really getting into it because I get reminded by a lot of them, you know, to use the traditional names even when I forget myself. So
yeah.
yeah, it's a really nice thing to see, I would say.
I feel like that's such an important tradition because it's you're really paying homage and you're really speaking to the past that existed before. So the
Mm,
sense of erasure that occurred before, you're sort of trying to, as you said, reclaim uh, and speak to a
yeah,
time that was before and honor that time.
yeah,
So
definitely.
as we're speaking about Indigenous people within Australia, I wanted to speak about your own identity. So you're of
Mm,
Fijian descent. You're raised in Brisbane, Meanjin, and you're exposed to the Indigenous culture within Australia. Where
mm.
in all of those layers, how did you develop your own identity within all of that?
Well, like I said before, being adopted played a big part in it because my my adoptive family, even though my dad is white Australian and my mother is Fijian and Vanuatu, so that's her twin heritages that she gets from her parents were actually what a lot of people would call whitewashed. So my family, even the brown side of my family, is quite Australian. So for me, it's been a search almost for myself for my own like cultural practices, and it's only been since I got older and was able to connect with other Polynesians or Melanesians my age, that I've been able to actually learn about our own cultural practices and what is actually a part of our culture and our heritage. So that's actually been a journey I've been on by myself. I mean, my two younger brothers are from different countries anyway, so they're on their own journeys. My brother, younger than me, is from New Zealand, so he is actually Maori, which is the indigenous people of New Zealand. And my other younger brother is half Filipino and half Tongan. So this has really been a solo journey for myself. I would love to say that I was raised in our culture, but it's really just been a journey for myself, really. But I've just learned that I very much identify with my Polynesian heritage. I love the practices of you know, our people. I think that it is a big melting pot, especially with the islands in the Pacific and South Pacific.
Yeah.
We do share like such a strong connection. So it's been really beautiful, especially in later years, joining the activism groups that I've been able to join. I've been able to learn a few of like the cultural dances, and I'm starting to like learn a bit of the language of some of these other islands. So yeah,
Yes.
it's been good. I think that's my identity. I feel like I'm still very much on a search for my own identity.
Mhm.
Um, but you know, I know that that's very individual to me because I do know that a lot of Polynesian children on this side of the world really grow up in strong cultural environments, and that I think that's something that I've always searched for because I've always felt a little bit displaced by that. But you know, definitely still identify as a proud Fijian man, a proud queer Fijian man. So yeah, I would say that is definitely what I still identify with.
As you were speaking, I'm wondering the Polynesian community, did you find that on your present journey that you've been accepted into these communities? So having been, as you say, whitewashed and having several layers of identity that you carry with you, do you find that when you go in search for the pieces of your cultural heritage that you are welcomed by the communities? Or do you also find that there's a sort of like, well, you're not fully this or not fully that? What has been the reception so far?
I would definitely say it's been like 70-30%. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
most people are very accepting, but I mean, like in any sort of culture, there is a stigma to outsiders or people who might not know who they are. So, I think that there has been a few people in my experience that have sort of been, oh, you do things this way, you do things the Australian way, because I was raised differently. But mostly, I found a lot of acceptance. I found a lot of people very willing to educate me, to just share with me. I think that's just sort of part of that lifestyle, though. It's a sharing kind of culture. You know what I mean? And it's also been, as someone who's sort of, um, just sort of grown into their identity, like in terms of sexuality, like being part of the Polynesian community has also been a very huge stepping stone of that, because pre-colonization, being queer, being trans was not, it was a celebrated part of our culture. So, that's what I found, like, through getting to know like other Polynesians and Melanesians, is learning that, as a part of that culture, it's actually very accepted, and it's helped me to unlearn a lot of the biases and negative thoughts that I had around my own sexuality growing up. So yeah, it's been a very rewarding experience.
That's so interesting because well, on the Western side, in my own experience, you've come to understand the LGBTQI journey, even from the outside looking in, as one where there's always been a fight for recognition. And so it's
Mm,
interesting to see that you're saying that within the Polynesian community, they're like, no, this has always been an accepted part,
mm,
not even
yeah.
accepted, just understood part of being and existing within
Mm,
the world.
yeah, look, I mean, there still is a lot of there's religious, double standards there still, because I'm Polynesians are famously known for having taken on Christianity, you know, huge. I myself consider myself an active Christian, but like, there is sort of like this strange unspoken thing where, there is the religious aspect of a lot of Polynesian communities where being LGBT is spoken out against, but because it is also such a huge part of our culture, it's
Mhm.
celebrated at the same time.
Right.
It's not fully accepted, but yet it's also celebrated, which is very, it's a very weird dichotomy. Like,
Yeah.
it's sort of like this balancing act almost between,
Mhm.
westernized thinking and our traditional thinking. A lot of people don't know that either, like, because a lot of what we see in Polynesian communities is very heteronormative. I mean, like, a lot of the famous football players here are Polynesian.
Yeah.
People see Polynesian communities as being very Christian, very religious, and yet, trans women have a huge role in Polynesian society, especially Samoan society. Trans
Mhm.
women have a very huge, celebrated, ancient role as a part of that culture, and yet they are still disparaged by the same people that celebrate them, if that makes sense.
So it seems like it's on occasion. It's like when
Yeah,
from what you, so I don't know if I can liken it to, so from Trinidad and Tobago, and so we have
mm,
carnival every year. So during
yeah,
the 2 days of carnival, everything is
mm,
allowed. Everything and the kitchen
yeah,
sink is allowed. But come
yeah.
Ash Wednesday, none of that behavior is acceptable. It is now
Oh,
debaucherous, unacceptable behavior. So it
yeah,
feels a
it's
little bit like
exactly
that
like that.
dichotomy a little. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
very. It's very that, like in Polynesian culture, trans women are seen as being the height of femininity, the height of womanhood. They are, in ancient times, they were a very celebrated, very revered part of the culture and a very revered part of society, and that carries over to today. So when we have what we call floor shows or socials. And myself and say my trans sisters. I'm not trans myself, obviously, but like my trans sisters come up and we all do performances as queer individuals. We have people that will celebrate it and they'll say, this was a beautiful performance. We love it because that's their culture. That's what they're used to. But then come Sunday morning, they'll be in church talking against it. So it's
Yes,
it's a
yes.
very interesting,
The
yeah.
duality. So
Yeah.
how have you sort of found your own communion between the two? Because you say that you yourself are Christian and you also identify
Mm.
as a queer man. So where have you found that communion between the two that allows you to embrace both?
Look, I had to really come to an understanding that what my understanding and what my relationship with God was going to be is going to be something that people will flat out say, well, that's not possible. I had to come to terms with that firstly, but I had to do my own research first. Like my coming out process to my parents was about a 2-year process when I decided to do it. I thought I need to go in and I need to study the Bible front to back. I need to um, get into what religious scholars, theologians have to say about different things. To be okay with this, I have to know for sure that I'm
Right.
not just following my own inclinations, which now I look back and I sort of think, your heart is what should always lead you. But I had to know for myself. I think it was also like a
Mm,
thing that if I do take this to my parents, I have to be like, look, I've done my own research, I've done my own study, I've had my own prayer on this. This is what
right.
I've come to. I know you won't agree, but I know that I'm okay with it. So, I found, what's funny though, it is just a plain fact that a lot of people ignore that issues like homosexuality in the context of the Bible are not as frowned on as people want you to believe it is. So I mean, in doing my own research into the Bible and my own research into what the Bible says about homosexuality or that sort of thing, it doesn't really speak against homosexuality the way that Western culture wants you to believe it does. And in a lot of way, I found that like what I realized was that the Bible was being very much weaponized by people to judge a community that they didn't understand or were afraid of. And that's sort of where I'm at with it. And I know that there are people who will just flat out disagree with me, so I had to, you just have to come to that understanding when you're a practicing Christian who shares that faith, but you're also LGBT. You just have to get used to that fact that there are people who are going to say, well, no, you're wrong, that's actually not right, that's not factual, and people will just disagree with you. So that was a huge part of it, was coming to peace with that. But I mean, also I am very much, I think like just being raised in a Christian household as well. It's funny because like even though my family had a lot of trouble coming to terms with my sexuality, they were the ones who taught me that a relationship with God isn't dependent on law, it's dependent on your heart and your connection with him. So I feel like that sort of knowledge has always been there and that kind of understanding has always been there for me. I just had to make it match up to what I understood theologically. And I feel for myself that I feel like a lot of 21st century scholars and theologians would agree with that as well. But
Yeah.
it is such an endemic part of Christian culture to just be flat out against homosexuality, be flat out against transness, that a lot of people don't bother to do that research for themselves. So,
Right.
really, that's where I feel like I'm very, I definitely, I love telling people that I'm an active Christian, especially in the LGBT sphere, because a lot of people don't think it's for them. They think that it's a religion that has no place for them. And I'm like, well, a religion is the people, it's not the buildings. So if you feel like you have a connection and this is something that will give you strength, this is something that you've been searching for, don't be afraid to look into this faith
Right.
system, just because of what you've been told. Like this is something that is for you. It's not necessarily something that you have to share with other people in that sort of
Right.
sense.
Right. Well, if I can be devil's advocate for a second, if the Polynesian heritage already is more accepting towards the trans experience, the LGBTQIA community,
Mm,
someone might say, why not gravitate to where there's acceptance versus moving through the sort of like Christian community, which is not as accepting of
Mm,
the LGBTQIA community. So what I guess what I'm asking too is also what in Christianity makes you go, no, this I can claim this.
mm.
This is for me, and I can be who I am. They're not two mutually exclusive things.
Look, I would say to answer your first question, like you were saying, I mean, to me, I think a lot of it is linked to ingrained misogyny and ingrained sexism in Christian circles. There is, for some reason, I feel an ingrained fear of anything that's feminine, anything that seems to be feminine and powerful. People just don't like it. And that includes homosexuality, little gay boys that show more of a feminine side, trans women. There seems to be like just this fear of anything that is feminine is something that can weaken someone, and I feel like even the Bible itself, like even though it seems like the Bible really talks about gender perceptions and gender roles, I feel like the Bible itself really shows that there are feminine figures in there that are very strong and very capable of leadership, and I think it really harkens back to that. It really harkens back to, oh, I mean, when you look at it, when you look at the way people act and you look at the way people will treat an individual who is LGBT, there is people don't often know why, like they go out and they will gang bash some little gay boy. They don't know why they'll jump a trans woman. They don't know why. All they know is there's something in them that's telling them that that's wrong. It's I feel like it really is just misogyny. It's just a fear of anyone who sort of adopts feminine behavior, is feminine, who isn't a woman. Like there is a fear of that,
Mhm.
and I think that's just been ingrained in so much generational upheaval and displacement, especially for Polynesian communities, like that they've lost that acceptance of feminine figures in their communities and societies. Like it's funny because, like I was saying before, it's such a celebrated part of Polynesian society being trans, and or as like the Samoans call them, whawhawhinés, is the traditional name. Like there's such a celebrated role in traditional cultures, um, and yet for some reason it's just once those people, like I said, they get to it on Sunday, they adopt almost a westernized thinking of it,
Right.
where it's sort of like, oh, okay, no, that's not okay anymore because we're in
Right.
Australia, we're not in the islands, we're in Australia, and this is where this is what's the norm now. So that's where I would really think that comes to, and as well for your second question, which was, I think you were asking about, what would I say to someone who was looking to like adopt that faith as their own?
Yeah, like
What would I?
what makes you be able to claim the Christian faith when it seems to be in opposition to.
Yeah, look, I would say like I mean it is a buzzword of a lot of Christians in this modern day and age that they say it's not religion, it's relationship.
Mm,
That's what a lot of Christians will say. It's a very like, it's a very early 2000s view of Christianity. Like, when Christianity has its little reforms every 10 years to sort of modernize itself, that's sort of very much a thing in Christian society that people say these days. And to me, I'm like, well, you know what? That is true. It's not about religion. It's not about the laws and the rules. It's about my relationship with God. That's my own, and no one can really define that for me. There are people who think that they can define that for someone else, but I mean, again, if you go back to Christian teachings, if you go back to what it says in the Bible, you can't define that for someone else. You can't point the finger at someone else and say, well, you're not a legitimate Christian, or you're not as Christian as I am because you do X, Y, and Z, because you could technically say that about anyone. So I think for me, it came from my own understanding of the teachings that I was brought up on, but then also my own like research myself. I know that that's not common for a lot of people. I say that, because that is how I came to that. And I would encourage other people who are going through this journey to do that also. But I know that that's not really going to be a common thing for a lot of people, because a lot of people they're just so used to hearing what they hear when it comes to faith and Christianity that they're not even willing to look in that direction anymore. They're just willing to go with what they've heard, which is that's not for me. But that is definitely my like standpoint on it. I will champion that to the end to say, no, this is a religion that's for you, but you've got to understand that if you're going to do this, and as an LGBT person, you are going to face backlash, you are going to face pushback. You have to be strong in yourself. You have to be strong in your own convictions for this. So,
So, as we're talking about the different layers that make up who you are as a human being, I'd like to
mm,
bring the conversation around to one of our main themes that we discuss, which is Blackness and Black identity. Now, I know you
mm.
also identify with you also have a sense of Black identity, and I'd like to get an idea of your journey, your history. How does that now fold in to the layered understanding of who you are?
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, my family has a history of slavery. That is how my family actually got to Australia. So I think back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Australia was still importing slaves from the Pacific Islands, mainly the islands of Vanuatu. They were going over and they were basically tricking these islanders to come on board, telling them that they were going to sell them, goods and tools and stuff like that, taking them below deck, then pulling up anchor and drifting out to sea, and then only letting them out when they were miles away from the shore. So that practice was what we call blackbirding. And basically, they would keep all the young men, the able bodied men, and the boys who were going to grow into men who could work, and then they would throw all of the mothers and the elderly men off the ship. So they would throw them off into the ocean and let them drown and keep on sailing over to Australia. And they would then put these individuals into works on cane plantations. So because Queensland and Australia is such a tropical, it's such a tropical environment. There will be a lot of cane plantations that they will put these sugar cane, that is, sorry, they will put them on to work in these plantations, and yeah, a lot of those men ended up either being deported when that act was abolished, so they would be deported back to their country even though they'd grown up here, or some of them would settle in their in the surrounding towns and make a life for themselves. And that is actually how my family was brought to this country. So I think we've only been here for about 5 generations, so not even that long ago. I think the
Right.
patriarch of our family, who was my great great grandfather, like I grew up with elders that remembered him and knew him. So it wasn't that long ago, and yet, yeah, Australian history books don't say anything about it. They say very little, a paragraph if anything. That's all you basically learn about in school, and yet it is the reason why I think Australian industry really took off. Like the Australian industry was really built on the backs of these men that were blackbirded from their homes and brought over here. And yet, yes, there's nothing about them in the history books, and yeah, that's played into a huge part of my identity. I remember being taught about this from a very very young age. I just remember I've always been cognizant of that,
Mhm.
and I think it's always played into why I carry my color and my culture so proudly. Even though I come from, and again, to play into why my family's so whitewashed, that's why they are, is because they've been in this country for a couple of generations now, and
Right.
their language was taken away from them, their culture was taken away from them, and they were adopted into a society that basically said, well, you have to act this way, we've brought you here, you have to act this way in order to be
Right.
part of acceptable decent society. And that's why, me being adopted into this family, I feel like I always wanted to search for that culture, but I couldn't even find the answers to that question from
Right.
the people that I lived with, because they unfortunately had been very much stripped of their cultural heritage. I think my grandparents
Right.
and my mother always loved the idea of that culture. They always appreciated it. We did have like artifacts and artwork hanging up in my grandparents' house, and we love to go back to Fiji and Vanuatu and visit, as my family have done for generations. But I
Right.
think because they're so world weary, and they live in a society that doesn't accept that, they've never really tried to adopt any of those cultures. So, that's it's very sad. Yeah.
So, can you draw the connection for many of us? Because when we think of the Fijian Islands and that community in particular, we don't necessarily think of Black slaves. We don't have the correlation. So, are you
Yeah.
able to sort of tell us how that happens? Because when I think of Fiji, Polynesia, Melanesia, I think of Pacific Islanders, and nowhere
Mm,
in my mind do I think of Africans from, Africa, or slaves
yeah.
from,
Yeah, well, look, I think because it happened on a much smaller scale, being that I mean, like, the islands are very small. All the islands are very smallly populated community, as opposed to what was going on in the transatlantic slave trade. It did happen on a smaller scale, but I think that was because, like, look, those islands were right there. It wasn't like they had to go elsewhere and find, they didn't have to cross an ocean necessarily. Those islands were right there. There were people who were from the same tropical climate. So it was very convenient. And I think that's why, it's not as out there, as what we know of the transatlantic slave trade. However, I think for those of us who are descendants of those people, we do relate. I think that's why we relate to, American urban culture so much, is because these are people that look like us. They have the same skin color as us, that are telling a story that we relate to. I mean, like, you come over to Australia, young Polynesians, young Melanesians, they really adopt the look and the affectations of American urban culture because we relate to it so heavily. It's people out there who are telling, who have the ability and are at that stage in their society where they can tell their story and be respected for it. I say respected for it, in quotation marks, because obviously, like, there's still a struggle there. But I think that's really why that is that it didn't happen on such a huge scale. But also, I think Australia is just the kind of society that is able to sweep things under the rug in a very polite way.
Mhm.
So it's almost like, Australian society is kind of the place that thinks, well, we're not as bad as America.
Yeah.
So the problem that we created can't be as bad. You know what I
So,
mean? Like, it's
yeah,
very that.
I think America is often used as that particular type of barometer. Well, we're not as bad as
Mm,
them. And it's sort of like to keep the wool over your own eyes. We're like, you live a good life. We're not as bad as those people over there. So just be
very that.
happy, you know?
Very that. I mean, it's sad, but I feel like, it's like people won't start acknowledging the hardships that, slaves that were brought to Australia went through until someone makes a movie about it. You know what I
Yes,
mean?
yes, yes.
Like, it won't be,
Mhm.
and then everyone will jump on the bandwagon. You know what I mean? Like,
Yes, like Roots, the Australian edition.
yeah,
That's what-
basically, like, it's a sad reality, but I feel like that's just the truth of it. So yeah.
So I think we're touching on this topic already, but I still do want to ask, can you speak in your opinion as to how
Mm,
race is stratified on your side of the world? Is it the same as the West? Like you already hinted
mm,
that Australia sort of sweeps things under the rug. Like, is blackness valued? Are there any nuances that you have experienced as compared to what you have seen or experienced in the West? Like, how is race balanced on
mm.
either sides of the world in your experience?
Yeah, I love that question because I think, like, there are a lot of parallels with what's going on with American society, but like I said, because Australian society is so good at sweeping things under the rug, I feel like that kind of movement is really fought with just what you would call pure ignorance. So rather than there being a huge backlash and there being people who are out and out racist, it gets pushed back against by people who are like, "Oh, you're being so oversensitive. Things aren't that bad here. Why are we having BLM marches in Australia? When that's an
I remember
American
hearing that.
problem.
I remember hearing
You
that.
know,
Yeah. Hmm.
and it's like it's a difficult thing for people to understand. I mean, I would say, you know, we as colored people not should be grateful, but I mean, like, I'm glad that we don't have that level of just out and out loud racist in Australia. But at the same time, it's almost like worse because these people don't see a problem.
Yeah.
It rather than saying, well, we think this way and we're outwardly against you, and this is the
Right.
way we want society to be. It's a bunch of people that say, well, there isn't really a problem.
Right.
So why are we doing this? Why are you
Right.
talking about America? When in actual fact, like, it's still a huge problem. Like, there are still deaths in police custody of indigenous people.
Right.
There's still all of that going on. There's still a huge, like, displacement, and generational issues and trauma for First Nations people, so the indigenous people of Australia, from what we call the stolen generation. That's a huge, like, talking point in Australia at the moment, because you get people who are saying, well, the stolen generation was for a good reason. These children that were taken from their homes and their families to be raised, they say to be adopted and raised by white families, but really they were just made into indentured servants.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they say that was a good thing.
Yeah.
It helped the indigenous people. And it's, clearly it wasn't. It's caused so much generational trauma.
Right.
That is very much the problem, that there is this horrible undercurrent and underside of Australian society that is built on and perpetuates racist behaviors and racist traumas, but it's covered by a layer of, oh, well, we're not as bad as America.
Yeah.
Like, it's just this continual cycle, and that's why I think those cycles continue, is because people are so ignorant to the fact that it has such a huge impact on even today's generations. I mean,
Yeah.
the Australian identity, like, as in, like, the Australian white identity, is very much that Australia is a country of lovable larrikins. Like, they're lovable jokers. Australians can take a joke, they're laid back, that kind of thing. So because people are like, well, that's how Australia is. We can take a joke. We're da 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 da. And then you get, like, these younger generations that are raising up to say, well, actually, this is the problem that I'm experiencing, and it's a problem that the generation before me experienced, and the generation before that. And then you just have a bunch of people that are just like, you're just too sensitive. That's the
Yeah.
problem. You're just too sensitive. That was in the past. I don't know why you're bringing that up now. Like, and so I feel like that is, like, the biggest struggle is a lot of young people of color these days are searching for that recognition. They're
Yeah.
searching for recognition of what was done to their ancestors and what was done to their
Yeah.
grandparents and even their parents. And
Yeah.
Australian society just likes to, like I've said so many times, like, just sweep it under the rug as something that generations these days are too sensitive about. I would definitely say that's what formulated not only my black or brown identity, but it formulates a lot of other individuals that are people of color. I feel like that is what really formulates their identity as well. Is this constant push for this recognition, because everybody, I mean, like, I put it this way, so many, like, Australian middle class women will go to the cinemas and they love The Help. you know
Right.
they love
Yeah.
that movie. They
Yeah.
loved, I love Viola Davis in The Help. I love that, like, it's very that.
Mm-hmm.
But yet when race is brought up in their own backyard, they don't want to hear a word of it.
Right.
Like,
Right.
that kind of, it's that kind of ignorance to be able to just push
Right.
that to the side. You know what I'm saying? So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that sort of sentiment and philosophy is echoed throughout the world in many different communities. And
Mm,
we use America for the barometer for for racism, but even
mm,
within America itself, I remember, like, years ago, New York was considered more liberal than you would think, like some other places in the South, and what that liberalism would mean would probably
mm,
be more inclusive and just genuinely more open to community. But what I've realized too, as you were talking, is that there's also a lot of whitewashing, as well, as you mentioned. So it's a very
mm.
similar circumstance of, well, we're not as bad as the South, like those people are
Yeah.
just downright racist.
Oh,
We're
I see. Yeah.
we're not as bad as the South, where but as you
Mm,
say, it's very insidious, because the fact that you don't think that you have the inclination to be racist can sometimes be
mm,
worse, because then
Yeah.
when you are performing racist activities or engaging in racist behavior, you can never see it as such because you've already deemed yourself for all eternity impossible to perform, to behave
Yeah.
in that way. And it's more likely to happen
Exactly.
in spaces that say that no, we are not about that, that's not who we are. But because they
Yeah.
don't explore in a deeper way what does that mean, and how, like, it's
Mm.
not just like you stand on one side and you say, well, I'm not racist, and so then you're not racist forevermore. Because
Mm.
the land has been built on racist behaviors and racist institutions,
Yeah.
it's difficult to not perform racist behaviors, even if you're in a
Exactly.
more even if you're in a more liberal
Oh, very,
liberal communities. And
very
so,
much
as you
so.
say that, yeah, and even coming from the Caribbean as well, too, we would not consider ourselves racist in any way. But when you look more closely, when you peel back the layers, because we don't talk about, well, I speak in the past more so, we never spoke about race in that way, in terms of like we are all like every episode I talk about the Caribbean seeming like one community. We are one. We don't sort of
Mm.
stratify in that way. But then when you look a little closer, you see the stratification is already done for you, whether you choose to look at it or not.
Yeah.
So
Very
it
that.
just comes out in different ways.
Oh, very. I mean, like, look, Australia really prides itself on being what they call a melding pot.
Yes.
I mean, much like, countries like America, and it's multicultural. We have a lot of multicultural identities, but I think, like, even just say a lot of people consider, like they might be very careful what they say about someone who is just like an outwardly brown person. So someone who is from the islands, or from Africa, as we have like a huge African population here too. They sort of think, well, I'm not saying anything against those people, but then they
Right.
might not realize how they're perpetuating racist stereotypes against, say, like Asians. You know what I
Right.
mean? But
Right.
like one of my a perfect example is one of my drag daughters, like, because we sort of form houses in the drag community, and one of my
Mm-hmm.
drag daughters recently entered a big competition in Brisbane, a big drag competition, and she had to bring a signature look. So she came down the runway in this beautiful traditional Filipino outfit because she's Filipino, and it was it was paying homage to, and was basically to represent the Muslim tribes in the Philippines. So she had like a lot of what a lot of people called her that night. They said, "Oh, you look like a Princess Jasmine," or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so she got down the end of the runway, and then basically when they were judging her, they didn't like it. They didn't see it as being as glamorous as the girls who were out there in sort of your
Yes.
typical Western idea of glamour, and
Mm-hmm.
they were like, you look quirky and exotic and
Yes.
quirky, and she took great offense, and then they didn't understand why. And
Mm-hmm.
she had to explain, to call something like that is of Asian heritage exotic is
Yeah.
probably one of the biggest offenses that you can say to an Asian person. She's like,
Right.
this is an outfit that is meant to be looked on with reverence.
Right.
This is to represent a religious, like, the religious beliefs of a tribe of people from where she comes from. It's not a Princess Jasmine look.
Right.
It's
Right.
not just a quirky exotic. She's like, I'm not just a westernized fantasy of the East. She's like, this is
Right.
actually something that has religious and cultural significance, and you're over here just dismissing it as being, and there was a big backlash, like, which I'm
Right.
glad there was, like, in the Brisbane entertainment drag community. There was a big backlash. It sparked a huge conversation. People were calling her too sensitive, or they were
Right.
calling, they called the judges out on what they saw. But a lot of, like, the judges didn't understand. They didn't get it. They didn't
Right.
understand why. And I think
Right.
that's a perfect example. It's like, well, I'm not out here burning a cross. I'm
Right.
not out here saying the N word. Like, it's like, well, no, but you've got to understand that there's so many different narratives of
Right.
what is okay, and there's so many different narratives of
Right.
cultural, displacement, that you can't just,
Right.
you can't just sort of singularly say, because I'm not doing this, I'm then not doing that. Like,
Right.
it's like, no,
Right. Yeah.
this is it, it's different. And even just as another POC, we've all got to learn and educate ourselves on what like, okay, there's things that might be offensive to me as a queer brown man, but you've also got to learn that you can't say those things to someone of Asian descent. You know what I mean? Like,
Right, right,
it's
right.
all a learning process. Like, that even I think we as POCs can also do to help other people from other cultures.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think too that if you're not open to realizing that you can perpetrate the same type of behavior, then you perpetuate it. So for them, it's
Mm,
they don't realize that what they consider as the baseline, the status quo is traumatizing because they're seeing it
mm,
from a very one-sided point of view. The fact that you called it
mm,
exotic, the fact that you call it's really it's very
mm.
traumatizing, and but they're
Yeah,
not able to see that because they're like, what, we're not racist, can we move on, lighten up,
yeah,
don't get
exactly.
your panties in a bunch, as they would say
Yeah,
you know
yeah, very, very much so.
so
Yeah.
I know you have been an active member within your community, advocating for the rights of LGBTQIA. How have you understood the intersection of experience within society as you carry differing minority mantles? Like, is there a hierarchy of
Mm.
discrimination? Do you have to fight to identify for all the parts of who that make up who you are? Do you find people need to contain who you are in a simplified box? That's just like five
Oh,
questions in one.
no, no, I totally get it. It's very true. I mean, like, the funny thing is that in asking that question, um, like, I'm glad you asked it because it allows me to really highlight that even within, say, the queer community, which is also another marginalized community, there is still a hierarchy within that community, and brown and black people are right at the bottom. Like, the queer community puts one type of person on a pedestal, and then you basically get graded underneath, and it's really sad because I mean I have friends that are almost they're only in their early 20s, and they're like, I'm giving up on dating. Like, they're like, I'm not dateable. I don't have I'm not skinny enough to be this, but I'm also not wide enough to be that. And I'm somewhere in between, and people don't like that. It's very sad, and that kind of thinking and that kind of activism has really been a baby of mine since I came out, and since I started becoming an active member of the LGBT community, because within the LGBT community, there is such little representation of brown bodies. There is such little representation on local levels and international levels. I mean, you look at RuPaul's Drag Race, even though that is led by a brown man, a cis brown man who is queer and is a drag queen, and very beautiful and very talented. Even on that international level, like, that is probably, like, the biggest platform of representation in the LGBT community. Even in that, there is still old racist tropes being played out about the brown queens that go on that show. All the brown queens, they either have to be lovable, what they, as they call the mammy
Mhm.
figures. They
Yes.
either have to be like that, and if they're anything else, they're seen as being angry brown women. Like, this, even on that level within our own community, there is still so many racist tropes that are just being played out season after season, and that's had such a trickle down effect into the local scenes around the world. I mean, now, because of that show, everybody has an opinion on what, for instance, drag is, and what the
Mm.
art form of drag is. So anyone who's different from that, like I was saying earlier about my drag daughter, anyone who's different from what that show is perpetuating,
Right.
like, now you've got audience members who've never done a day of drag in their life that are saying, well, that's not real drag because it's not A, B, and C. You know
Right.
what I'm saying? So, and then I mean, that's in the through the lens of drag, but just in terms of socialization, in the
Right.
clubs, in the gay community, white men are just they're at the top of that pyramid. They are at the very, very top. Anything under that is just, you're not allowed in this space. Why are you here? Like, that kind of thing. Like, the spaces that are occupied by LGBT people are basically, in Australia anyway, I can't speak for other countries, but in Australia, those spaces are occupied by white gay men.
Yeah.
So even in that marginalized community, it is still a fight for POC people to have that representation. You know, a lot of people have come up to so as you like said it, as I told you guys in my bio, like, I was a part of like the first POC all drag hip hop crew, because we all used to be hip hop dancers, and then we all transitioned into becoming drag queens, and so now we like use drag as our performance, as our performance art that we like to, sort of like use our dancing for. It's a vessel for our dancing, really. And we didn't realize the effect we were having until a lot of brown queer people were coming in, and that they were walking in and seeing our shows on the stage, and they were coming up to us afterwards and being like, "You make me feel like I can be here." They were saying things like
Right.
that. Like, they were coming up and being like, "I feel like I can be in this building for the first time." Like, they might have just been coming through, been breezing through on their way to another club, and then caught our performance, and they were like, "We feel like we have a place here now." Which
Right.
is it's so sad for me. I didn't realize, until I got into the scene, that that was like a huge problem. But like, a lot of brown people that are a part of the queer community don't go to the gay clubs, especially in my city, in Brisbane, Meanjin. A lot of them just go to the straight clubs because they feel more accepted there in the R&B clubs where there's other brown people than they even do in their own gay clubs. I mean,
Mhm.
you walk into gay clubs, they never play R&B music. They never play anything other than pop standards. It's always like Ariana Grande, Lady
Right.
Gaga, Kylie Minogue, all that stuff that white gays, I'm famous for relating to. They never want to have an R&B night. They never want to get in any R&B DJs. They never get in any brown performances. And
Yeah.
like the old saying goes, you can't be what you can't see.
Right.
So a lot of these brown queer people, whether they were trans girls, trans men, other like younger queer boys and girls, lesbians, whoever, would come into these clubs and think, I don't have a place here. There's nothing for me here. And even the attitude from other queer people in that environment were very, it's very like, very, what are you doing here? Like, this isn't a space for you. And that was very much the feel that a lot of these, like, brown queer young people were coming away from these clubs with. So it was very sad. So even in, like, like you say, what is it like carrying like the
Right.
mantles of just different marginalized communities? It's sad because it's like, you can't even, before you even get to go out there and be an activist and a representation for your communities out there in the mainstream society, you've still got all these fights happening within your own community that you need
Right.
to get past, and that you need to champion, and that you need to represent for. So even within, it's sad, but even within a marginalized community, there are marginalized communities.
Right. Yeah. And that's understandable because it's how, I mean, I don't know if we're ever leaving the plantation. I don't think we realize the
Yeah,
trauma that was inflicted that continues to reappear in different circumstances. You're all trying
yeah,
to still be at the top. So even though you're marginalized,
mm,
you're still trying to be at the top of the heap or whatever, you understand that to
yeah.
be, yeah. So you're a community in so far as you share the same values, but race is still at the bottom of it. Like race still seems to be at the center of the conversation
Look,
first.
yeah, look, it took me by surprise. But I never thought it was going to be a struggle I was going to face within the LGBT sphere. I didn't, because I hadn't been an active member of that community. I just was unaware that it was a problem. You know what I mean? So it took me by you couldn't have told me in a million years that that was which is very ignorant of me, but I mean, like, I stayed
Mhm.
away from the queer community myself before I actively came out and became a
Yeah.
performer. Um, and it took me by surprise how big of an issue that it is, and
Right.
and by how important it is for me and my group to be these visible figureheads in our community. How
Right.
important it was, and how much it get like, there was one girl who came out, and she's always supportive, and she was always like very at every show, and I was just like, look, I want to thank you. I want you to know how, I was saying to her, I was like, I want you to know how grateful I am it is to see your face in the crowd. It gives me so much confidence. And she's like, I want to thank you guys, because you guys are the people who made me feel like I had a place here. And that really struck a chord with me, and I was just like, no, like, we're doing so much more than just up here being performers.
So tell me, do you feel that your experience is just confirming your experience is a shared experience with those who have a similar I would say, migratory and heritage backgrounds? Do you feel like it's a shared experience in that way?
Mm, definitely. I would say very much. I would say definitely. If there's one thing that I've learned, um, delving into the sphere of activism, um, and just being vocal about all the problems that we do face as people of color, it's that it is a global story. Definitely a shared experience, especially when you are a part of a displaced community. So you are a part of, like, a society that has basically been uprooted and turned inside out and whitewashed. It surprised me that how many parallels you just see with people from other cultures. Like, even
Yeah.
in not just like, I mean, even people like talking to yourself and Shanita, and talking to people that I've met in an international sphere, but also in my own local hometown. Just even people that I've grown up with and that I've known. It's such a shared experience. That whole um, aspect of being on a balancing beam between trying to fit in the society that you grow up in,
Hmm.
and trying to also proudly the culture that you came from.
Yeah.
And it's like you're sort of always walking that line of knowing that the louder that you are in your cultural heritage and the prouder that you are, will mean the more misunderstood you are by the rest of society. And I
I
think that's something you learn as you grow. Like, when
yeah.
you're a kid, when you're a kid, all you want to do is fit
It's
in.
fit in.
And then
Yeah.
yeah, and then as you get older and you start to sort of be a lot louder, and you start to have more of that connection with with your past and your ancestors, the more you realize that it's like, the more I speak out on this, and the more I start to really delve deep into that, the more I'm going to lose friends,
Yeah.
or the more that people that I once called friends are going to sort of look at me a bit weirder.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely it, and I feel like that is such a universal experience for you know young you know young POC people everywhere. In whatever city you're in.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Just in terms of just thinking about my own experience, like what everything you just said, word for word. When you're younger, you just want to fit in and you want to
Mm,
excel at whatever the status quo is. So you
mm,
need to climb to the top of whatever the established order is in order to show
mm.
that you can be successful in this. And but the
Yeah.
more you learn that the more you learn about the struggle that's not yet over, because I would say in my case too, you said before,
Mm,
a big part of I often say on these episodes that I started doing this is because I myself, if you had asked me, I would have told you that America, the United States of America, was was on the side of like maybe racism light. We were moving beyond it, and only
yeah.
these past few years have been such an overwhelming wave, because when things were like too cultural for me, or too black, or too, all of those were things that I would be inclined to. I was like, can't we just be, I don't want to have to be super cultural, I don't have to be super, but it's
Mm,
because subliminally those things were not, they were not things that I could identify with because I didn't grow up with them, as you talk about being
mm,
whitewashed. And so
yeah.
they were also in the recesses of my mind, they were lesser than, they represented lesser
Yeah.
than. And we all know subliminally, walking into spaces, um what people consider professional, not professional, accepted. And
Yeah.
so we know the line we have to walk in order to be accepted. But then when you realize that there's such a disservice being done where you can't unsee. You'd like to
Yeah.
unsee, because nobody
Yeah.
actually wants to be like, I don't know if you woke up being, you know what, I want to be an activist, I want to find something to be. I
Yeah.
don't think you wake up wanting to
Yeah.
do that, but realizing that you can't move forward without doing it is the thing that propels you into the position. And as you said, it
Mm,
marginalizes you in some way even more, as the more you move towards towards claiming who you are, you marginalize yourself in spaces that would rather you just maintain the status quo.
Oh, no, exactly. And you know what? It's very, I mean, like, that's like a huge conversation that I think is going on in today's society, which I'm glad that everyone's having, because it's making everyone question and say, well, why is that? Why is that seen as professional? And
Mhm.
even to say, like, a white individual, the question is being asked, why do you think that's professional?
Right.
Because when you, I mean, you look when I mean you look at what is seen as acceptable, or like even the, I mean, you Google, all you have to do is search into Google "girl fired for wearing braids." How many
Mhm.
stories are going to come up?
Right.
And yet no one
Right.
can really explain why. You ask them, you say, well, why? I have this conversation with people in my own family, even my own father. Who has that very like view of, well, no, like, that's too alternative. That's
Right.
to this and that. You are, well, why? What makes that so alternative and so scary
Right.
that it deserves someone being fired or losing their job or losing the way that they put food on their table?
Yeah.
Why is that so bad? And I
Yeah.
think that's the question no one wants to answer, because the truth is that when you go back far enough or you dig deep enough, you know the reason why.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad that that's a conversation that's really being had at the moment. But I also
Yeah.
understand, like, it's very painful for some people. I mean, I feel like I'm very privileged as I mean, as a male and someone who can pass as being straight if I wanted to. I can, even though I'm brown, I can slip below the radar. But I feel for women who are coming up in this society, there is a lot more standards for brown women to adhere to than there is for brown men. We can kind of go under the radar a little bit with our appearance anyway, because there is
Yeah.
an element to that is acceptable. But for a brown woman who wants to wear a cultural hairstyle, or
Yeah.
wants to, dress a certain way that, you know offends no one,
Right.
like, really, like,
Yes.
in terms of what they consider to be a professional standard. Like, why
Yeah.
is it that brown women seem to really suffer under that aspect, I feel.
Yeah. Well, even this head wrap that I'm wearing is
Mm,
like the decision to wear it is an intentional one when I go into all of the spaces that I have to go into. And
yeah.
because I am aware that when you see this, you have your own perceptions, and I reject that.
Mm,
But in
yeah.
rejecting that, I also have to be okay with the fact that you're marginalizing me because of it. You're putting me in a
Yeah.
box that is somehow lesser than because of it. But even
Yeah.
for
Oh.
myself, because I was raised on those Eurocentric traditions myself. For me, putting on a head wrap, I have that inner conversation as well where, mm, is it professional? Not anymore. But initially, would I go to a job interview with this wrap on my head? Absolutely not.
Mm,
Because
yeah.
instinctively, I know that's not professional. That's not how you get a job.
Yeah.
But you don't know where it comes from and why isn't it professional?
Yeah. No,
It's
exactly.
but we never asked the questions before.
Yeah, exactly. And I memean, what you said before about, saying people don't just wake up one day and think, I want to be an activist.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge problem, is because that's that is one, the argument that I think a lot of people use is that they say that everyone is just jumping on a bandwagon when it comes to issues like this.
Hmm.
Everyone just thinks, eh, people, like, everyone wants to be part of a movement. Everyone wants to feel like they're involved. So that's why they don't take movements like BLM seriously, because they think everyone's just jumping on
Hmm.
a bandwagon. But if truth be told, I mean, I know that you probably have this experience as well, but like when I, um, you know, put up a post, or I go to call someone out within my own community, or I go to bring something up online in a public forum. I don't know about yourself, but I question it, like, before I do it. I'm not just out here
Hmm.
calling people out and calling people a racist and flinging accusations here and there because it's fun. I think about what I'm
Right.
doing, like, and to be honest, like, when you think about that, that is a POC person who wants to defend their culture, but is then second guessing
Hmm.
themselves about whether they're going to offend someone, whether this is going to affect someone's mental
Yeah.
health,
Yeah.
whether I'm going to, we're having to second guess even defending ourselves. For people to sort
Because
of
we've been taught to
assume
be
that,
polite. We've been,
yeah, exactly,
yeah, we've been taught to be polite, like ingrained in
yeah,
us. You have to be polite. You have to, when
mm,
it isn't always a two-way street. And I definitely agree with you. There is a weight. Every time that I have to say something that might be misconstrued, there's like tons
yeah,
of rereading just to make sure it can't be put in any other light other than what you intended it to be.
mm,
And it's
yeah,
it's it's because we know we're going against a machine, and you also know that your intent is not to slander, but your intent is to
mm,
clarify. But even that clarification can be offensive
yeah,
because
yeah.
it's not done. You don't do it.
Yeah. Well, see, if you take the idea of your head wrap as you brought up as a subject, that in wearing that, you have to shoulder a lot of looks and
Yeah.
assumptions and insult, like backhanded compliments and
Right.
insults that insult thousands of years of tradition and culture.
Right.
We're taught to just shoulder it, to turn the other
Right.
cheek and take it. But then when we go to defend that, we're sitting there on our phones rereading what we say, or second guessing
Right.
conversations, like preparing ourselves all to defend something that deserves to be
Right.
defended ferociously. But
Right.
we're there because, like you said, we're taught to be polite, so polite that we second guess defending ourselves and
Right.
our culture that's formulated,
Right.
thousands of years of history just to bring us to this point.
Yeah.
We're afraid to even defend that. So
Yeah.
I think, like, that's an important thing for people to realize, is that, no, like, this isn't a bandwagon thing. This isn't just people jumping on a trend. It's people
Right.
using their voices for the first time in a long time. But
Yeah.
even then, even though it seems like we should be righteously justified in doing that, even then we second guess ourselves. Even
Right.
then we're sort of thinking, am I going to ruffle too many feathers? Is this going to result in me losing my job? Is this going to result in me losing
Right.
friends? That's a question we all have to ask ourselves, and I think, like, that should really be thought
Yeah.
about by people who criticize that.
Right. And it's definitely always very nuanced. So no one is coming out, especially in liberal spaces, quote unquote. So no
Mm.
one will ever say, oh, your head wrap is unacceptable. But it's just so the way you spoke about the
Yeah,
exoticizing
the
of
exotic,
the
yeah,
of her costume of what she
yeah,
was wearing, it pretty much that same way. It's sort of like, oh, that's very ethnic. So it tells people where to place you. So if it's not
yeah, no, very
outright
much.
judgment, it's like, oh, that's a black thing.
Yeah,
That's a
yeah,
oh, that's a black thing. Instead of it just
yeah,
being a topic, for conversation.
yeah,
And the
very much so.
bandwagoning, I must say, Tyson, there is definite bandwagoning happening, but
Oh, for
mainly
sure,
mainly in corporate spaces where they
for
need
sure.
to
Yeah,
identify currently with what's happening, and they need to be seen as
yeah.
the face of solidarity. But in
Oh,
ma- but in
100%.
but in some cases, it's really, I don't even know if it's skin deep. It's moment deep. I think I'm gonna
Yeah.
say
Oh,
it's moment deep.
yeah.
uh,
It's reactive.
yeah, and it's sort of waiting for it to fade. I get a real sense of just put a few people in places, high profile places, so we can seem to be the thing that you need us to be, so we could get on with life.
Oh, very right. No,
And
very
so
100%.
yeah. So what I'm the one of the things I'm hoping that comes out of this pandemic is that it is a more sustained, because this is not the first time that there's been people of color have awoken to the fact that the injustices are egregious and want to do something about it. And
Mm.
we see how it sort of plateaus. So I'm hoping that this time we're able to make some significant headway in terms of realizing equity and equality,
Yeah.
especially in the workspaces. And at least at
Yeah.
the very bottom line, revisiting what it means to be professional and being definitely more inclusive across the board when it comes to that.
Yeah. Very that. Exactly.
Yeah. I feel like I can just talk to you all night, Tyson.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I know we want to wrap up soon, and I want to give you the opportunity to just tell us anything that's on your heart. Tell us about the work you've been doing and your mission in general beyond what we've discussed so far. And tell us how
Mm.
we can keep in touch with you for those who'd like to reach out or be a part of what you're doing.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would definitely say that my mission, as what it's come to and what I've realized it is in the last few years, I'm very passionate about representation of brown bodies in all spheres. Like I said before, I'm a very passionate believer in you can't be what you can't see, like I said before. And I think that's just one of the things that I've found is so important. And I've realized in being someone who is a visible figure for younger queer people, queer POC people in my own community, I realized how much I needed that as a child myself, and how much it was detrimental to me that I didn't see people like myself, on stages being celebrated in the mainstream sphere. So for me, that is very much my mission, is just to um, keep being that representation, but also because I am venturing more and I have been in the producer sphere. So I've been in the sphere of being a producer in like the last couple of years. It's just creating opportunities. So I really want to create events, create performance showcases, create nights and events where POC people are front and center and a spotlight is shone on them, and that they can represent themselves in through the lens of their own culture, so that they can say this is what my culture brings, this is what I bring to the table, and to really show the beauty of POC cultures within my own city. That is very much like what I'm passionate about. So, just creating opportunity and awareness is something. You can follow all of my work on Thick Shake Crew on Instagram. So that is where we do a lot of our advertising, and you can keep up with our shows that we're doing and a lot of our activism. I encourage everyone to follow Runway Movement on Instagram, which is Meanjin's performance activist group that I'm a part of. It is a queer POC collective, and it is people of not only Polynesian descent but many different ethnicities around Brisbane. It's a beautiful collective, and I would also encourage everyone to follow House of Alexander on Instagram, which is the ballroom Vogue house I am on, which is really celebrates Vogue culture, which came out of New York, and we are a pioneering house in the Brisbane scene. We're an official part of the Australian ballroom scene as well. And I would encourage everyone to not just follow my house, but look into your local area and look up the collectives and the activist groups, and even the Vogue houses in your own local city, because supporting those grassroots foundations and those grassroots organizations really helps with uplifting and the celebration of brown bodies in those like performance spheres. So I would encourage everyone to not just follow my stuff, but follow all of that stuff in your local city, because they're everywhere. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tyson. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for this wonderful conversation that we were able to have. I'm really honored to have been able to share or be a part of you talking about the different experiences and the journey that you've had to date. So thank you very much. I want to thank our audience as well. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time in the pursuit of.
This podcast has been powered by Mars Playhouse, a theater and film company dedicated to increasing the lexicon of Black plays and films emanating from the Caribbean and its diaspora throughout the globe. Thank you for your support in growing this podcast community. Don't forget to hit the like button and follow us on IG, Facebook, and Twitter at Mars Playhouse for details on upcoming podcasts and content surrounding the Caribbean and its diaspora.